Old couple enter restaurant, 5 men follow them inside. The man took his first step and the restaurant fell quiet again. Ian, wearing his favorite US Navy Vietnam veteran cap, sat upright and locked eyes with him. He hadn't bothered with the men at first, but seeing that they were focused on him, he carefully studied them. What he saw made his stomach knot. When Ian visited his local restaurant that evening, he only wanted to spend time with his wife and enjoy his favorite steak and eggs. The day had been long and Ian was glad it was finally coming to an end. But what would happen to him and his wife in that restaurant would leave them shook. Ian, alongside his wife, Essie, lived in a small town near the outskirts of South Carolina. The couple had been married for nearly half a century, with decades of memories shared between them. Essie managed a bakery in town, while Frank spent time with his army buddies, given he was a proud Vietnam vet. He had no clue what his identity would lead to inside that restaurant. Ian and Essie had several hobbies and pastime activities they loved to engage in. Among these was visiting a local restaurant for the best steak and eggs Ian had ever had. The two had frequented the joint for decades now. They had been there in the late 80s when its owner first opened. Ian never expected it to be where strangers would brazenly walk up to him. The day began nicely enough for Ian. The sun was bright outside and the air was fresh. After a shower and a big breakfast, the 70-year-old vet said goodbye to his wife and went work on his truck in the garage. Afterward, he visited his wife's bakery for lunch before heading off to one of his friends' houses for a quiet afternoon. He'd later join Essie for a drive that would land them in the restaurant. The place was packed with customers when Ian and Essie walked in. Luckily, management saved them a booth where the two quickly sat. They ordered their usual beefsteak and eggs, accompanied by a generous serving of Worcestershire sauce and chimichurri. Patiently waiting, the two chatted over the passion fruit drinks their waiter had served them. It was then that it happened. 5 towering men walked into the restaurant and like a scene from an old western, the whole restaurant fell quiet. They scanned the place, quickly finding a booth on the diner's furthest corner. Ian paid them no mind at first. He'd lived through his fair share of hulking men who wanted nothing but trouble. He didn't know that the men already had their sights on him and his wife. Ian and Essie's food came and the two quickly enjoyed the succulent meal. But as they continued eating, one of the men sprung up from his seat. One of his companions nodded at him and he turned around, a massive fellow made out of chiseled muscle with an intimidating look. His burning gaze was focused squarely on Ian. The man took his first step and the restaurant fell quiet again. Ian, wearing his favorite US Navy Vietnam veteran cap, sat upright and locked eyes with him. Ian hadn't bothered with the men at first, but seeing that they were focused on him, he carefully studied them. What he saw made his stomach knot. Each of the men had high and tight haircuts, which, combined with their physiques, could only mean one thing. They were service members. Ian's sight returned to the one advancing toward him. He'd never seen a gaze as piercing as the man. He should have been worried that such a group chose to single him out, but he wasn't. He'd teach them a lesson. Ian squared his shoulders as the man reached his table. In his days in service, he'd met a handful of service members who enjoyed causing trouble. Ian had always believed in respect. If these 5 men were out to cause trouble, he'd show them that despite his age, he still had a few tricks up his sleeve. He only hoped it wouldn't get to that. A smile stretched across the man's face. But it wasn't a malicious one. Ian's brows quirked as his lips curled to match the man's smile. What was happening? "We saw your cap, sir," the man began after greeting Essie too. "We wanted to thank you for your service." Ian's mouth fell open. He thought it was over when another man from the 5 came. They would leave Ian in tears. "I want to thank you for all 5 of us," the man began. Ian thanked and wished them the best in their careers. The men returned to their table, leaving a stunned Ian and Essie. The couple finished their dinner and asked for their check. Ian hadn't expected any of this to happen. He didn't know what the men had done behind his back. The waiter brought the check and to Ian's surprise, it was cleared. The waiter pointed at the 5 men in the corner, who waved back with smiles. Across the check, the men had written Semper Fi in Ura, which brought Ian to tears, given that he had served in the Marine Corps. Could anything be more heartwarming? Wiping his tears, Ian stood up. But as he helped Essie to her feet, 4 of the men filed over to his booth. Each of them shook Ian's hand, hugged him, and walked to his side. The last man walked over and, after shaking and hugging Ian, gave him the sharpest salute he'd ever seen. "He fought for us. Now it's our turn," the men said while talking to the town's local news. What a wholesome group of servicemen. Disclaimer. To protect the privacy of those depicted, some names, locations, and identifying characteristics have been changed and are products of the author's imagination. Any resemblances to actual events, places, or persons, living or dead, are entirely coincidental.